All right, so you think this is...
Yeah, it's World of Warcraft.
You think
for sure.
that is...
2004.
that is a
Yeah,
close
do
one?
it.
Okay.
Warcraft.
04.
Yeah.
Called it.
Nice.
I was there. At the doors, waiting at midnight at GameStop in the mall in Sheboygan, Wisconsin.
Nice. Good morning. Welcome to Board Game Barrister, our local game shop in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm Andy, and I'm here with Elizabeth, Ian, Glenn, and Gordon, and today we're talking timeline, twist, pop culture, a really cool spin on one of our favorite history games of all time called Timeline. This one's cooperative. Let's get into it. Welcome to Timeline, Twist, Pop Culture, a cooperative game where we're going to work together to get as many events into our central timeline as possible. When the game starts, we're going to flip one card from our deck to start our timeline. This one happens to be Will disappearing in Stranger Things. That happened in 1983 in the fictional course of the show. And you can see here that this card has a black border on this side, which means that that's the side that shows the date. It also has a white border on the other side that doesn't show the date. And that's so that each player can have a hand of 4 cards face down in front of them with the white border facing up. So we don't know the dates necessarily, unless you just know the date of the events that are in your hand. Now your goal is to play as many of those cards as possible into that central timeline. So on your turn, you can play a card, and then you can even play a second card if you want to. Let's say our player wanted to start playing some cards, and they said, alright, I want to play the release of the novel Dune, and in order to play a card, you just choose it, flip it over, and then see where it belongs in the timeline. If it's before all the other events that happened in the timeline, we put it on the far left. If it's after, we put it on the far right. This one happened before Will disappearing, so we're going to slot it in right here. And let's say they wanted to play a second card as well, just for the sake of getting more cards out on the table. They'll play the creation of Vine as well. That's 2012. So that happened after all the other events in our timeline. 2 is the most you can play in your turn, and at the end of each player's turn, they're going to fill back up to 4 cards. So this player draws the release of Gangnam Style and the release of Jurassic Park. Now, because it's a cooperative game, the other players are going to be contributing to the same timeline, and we're going to try to get as many cards into the center as we can. That's how you score more points. One other thing that can happen when you play a card, like if I played Gangnam Style, is that it matches another card's year exactly. This one's 2012, just like the creation of Vine, so these two are going to overlap. Now, the most important thing to keep in mind about our timeline is that each pair of adjacent cards has space for exactly one more card between them. What I mean by that is, if I played the release of the Jurassic Park movie, for instance, that was in 1993, which means it would slot in between Will disappearing and Gangnam Style. Instead of slotting it in though, I can never actually open up gaps between these cards. I'm going to put it in the gap spot right above both of those cards. Now I've filled that gap, nothing else can live in this gap. So this is where some of the strategy in the game comes in, because you're trying to keep the year gaps between each new card you play out as small as possible to the other cards so that we have more room to keep playing cards on the ends, because we can only fill in these gaps so much before we run out of space. Because now if a player played something like the release of One More Time by Daft Punk, that's in 2000, which means it just can't fit anywhere. It would try to live right where Jurassic Park is. That's going to go back to that player sideways to signify that it can't be played. A player has to be able to play at least one card out onto the timeline on their turn, or the game ends on all of us immediately. So if this player kept trying different cards and they kept coming back to them sideways until they were out of cards to try, then we lose. So that's why we want to keep those gaps small, but there's also one more thing you can do to try to offset the danger of running out of cards you can play in your hand, and that is to, instead of playing cards on your turn, discard a single card. The one other thing we're going to do when the game starts is grab one card to start our discard pile, black border up, and it's going to have a symbol in the top corner that you've been seeing on all these cards here. How the discard pile works is that if a player doesn't feel like they want to play any of their cards, they would rather play it safe and get rid of one of their cards that they think might be a problem later, they can choose a card that matches the symbol on the top of our discard pile. So I've got a sand timer here on top right now, and so does the creation of Starbucks. So if they wanted to discard the creation of Starbucks, they just put it on top of the discard, and they flip it over, which will reveal a different symbol so somebody else can discard if they need to. We're going to keep playing like this, trying to get as many cards into that timeline as we possibly can until one of 2 things happens. Either somebody's going to have a turn where they just can't get any of their cards out because all the gaps are already filled and they can't get their cards in, or we're going to go through the entire deck, in which case we keep going around trying to empty our hands, get them as far as we can, and if we do get everybody's hands empty, then the game ends and we've done pretty well. We're going to score ourselves at the end, and we get 2 points for each card that's in our main timeline row, and then 1 point for each card that's in our gap row, but we lose a point for every card in our discard pile, every card that's still left in our hands, and every card that's still left in the deck if we didn't happen to empty it. And there's a little chart in the back of the rulebook that's going to tell us how we did.
The sheer variety of content that's in this game is super great. There's all kinds of topics, from film to books to sports. There's video games in there spanning all over the timeline. So all the way from prior to 1900 all the way up until really just there was a 1920, there's a 2021, 2022 card in the deck.
Technically a
2266.
Okay, and some of them were fictional events. That's the
Yeah.
that's the real twist on this, is some of them were in the fictional world of blah 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 show or movie.
Yeah.
What year does this event for the characters take place?
Marty McFly arrives in the future. That is...
Oh.
2012.
No, it's...
80. But he went there when he was in the 80s, right?
But he arrives in what year?
He arrives...
He arrives in
It's got to be
He's on his
2000
hoverboard,
something, right?
so yeah. It
Two-
was,
2012?
That's what I think.
Something
it is.
like that. And then
Okay.
the release of the video game Minecraft.
Oh.
The diversity of content is what makes it interesting. Like having the different types of people who are playing have different niche pieces of knowledge, especially in the pop culture version, was really cool for me because we were able to be like, yep, I know the exact year that the TARDIS thing happened. That I don't know anything about Doctor Who, but Gordon does, luckily. So we were able to play together and put it in the correct timeline. Whereas I knew, when World of Warcraft released or when Twitch started streaming or whatever it might be. So I really like that the diverse amount of content really leans into the different people's knowledge bases when they're playing. So
well, and they divided Timeline Twist into two separate games. You can get Timeline Twist's original proper, which is like all of human history, and you can get the pop culture one, which is the one we played today.
Most game groups that you could play with are gonna have some direct context for the cards that you're playing. It also means that who you're playing with is going to make a big difference. So, obviously as coworkers, we're kind of a slightly mixed age group, but there's not a wide span. If you played with a family group with multiple generations, you might see it really interesting. The kids, the Gen Z are going to know all the cool new Twitchy, TikToky things. And then, your grandparents are going to be able to talk about the 50s and 60s and whatnot. And if you play with a Fen group, maybe your experience is totally different and you've all experienced the same things together because you're in the same generation. It just depends. Alright, so then the only thing that I have after Slim Shady is Twitch is launched. And then everything that I have here, let's see, Tetris is going to be in a gap, we think. Breakup of the Beatles, was that before 72 or after 72?
Oh, it might be a 71. Yeah.
Go Beatles.
Well, if I play Breakup of the Beatles, then we find out whether my Tetris is playable or
Well,
not.
sure.
Sure.
Or you can go to Cassius Clay. I have played a lot of the original timeline in all of its incarnations, and I played with lots of different topics. But what I find in playing that game is your interaction with the other players is as a gotcha. Oh, you got that one wrong. I knew where that one was. And so it's this very much of I knew something you didn't. Or sometimes, oh, that's a surprise. You got it right. I'm glad you saw that. But what I really liked about playing Timeline Twist was the collaboration.
Yeah, well, and I think that feeling of, the gotcha or the superiority of I know where that is, don't flip it yet, I'll tell you you're wrong, is not in this. It's I know where that is, I'm helping you tell you where it's right. So the whole conversation was much more supportive and collaborative, like you said, which I think is really fun.
Okay, so I've got most liked photo of an egg.
Yeah.
That's going to be
Somewhere in there,
at least the later aughts, if not into the teens.
Yeah.
Because we have to have the concept of liking.
Here's an interesting thing to
I
remember.
think
The
you're
like button has been around on Facebook for a long time, but the share button, which is what caused things to go viral, didn't get invented until 2012.
I also like how on some of the cards, they give you some subtle hints. Like the release of the first video game for FIFA, and there's a GameCube on the thing.
Yeah.
This video game one where you've got this older style TV, so you get some kind of ideas. Because like GameCube, I'm not going to... Just knowing GameCube, I'm not going to think, well, this is like 2020.
Right.
Because GameCube was so long ago that you know a little bit better of where you can fit stuff. But that's only some of the cards.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, this is a history game. Pop culture, a little bit less so, I would say. It doesn't feel as much like a history game. Original Timeline Twist, definitely a history game. But the one thing I would say is that the box says it's for ages 8+. And while I believe an 8-year-old could interact with the cards and putting them into the timeline and play the game properly, I don't think you'd actually start having fun with this game until you were at least 12, maybe even a little bit older than that, just to have some reference for the events in it. And that was Timeline Twist Pop Culture. Thank you so much for joining us this week. We had a fantastic time with it. As always, hit that like button, leave a comment if you got a comment, subscribe if you want to see our videos every single week when we post them, and check out our online store. We got Timeline Twist Pop Culture, we got Timeline Twist Original, we got all sorts of cool stuff. Thank you so much for joining us this time, and we'll see you next time.
Take us out.
And that was and that was Timeline Twist. Thank you so much.